My name is Ethan Cross. I was born on October 14th, 1980, in Chicago, Illinois. For 20 years, I built skyscrapers that defied gravity. But 3 months ago, I was brought to my knees, staring at a small mahogany casket. I stood beside my son's empty grave while elite society whispered hollow condolences. I couldn't even hear anymore. And last night, the dead knocked on my front door. Not metaphorically. Not in a horrifying nightmare. My 7-year-old son, Noah, stood outside barefoot in the freezing rain, trembling, staring at me with hollow, terrified eyes. Then he whispered 6 words that completely destroyed my entire world. Dad! Mom said I should have died. If you have ever been betrayed by the people who swore to love you, if you've ever wanted to see AI manipulative, narcissist, get exactly what they deserved after executing the ultimate act of cruelty. Take 1 second to hit that like button. Comment below where you are watching from. And get ready, because this isn't just a story about survival. It is the blueprint for a cold, calculated, and absolute psychological execution. Before the world went dark, Ethan Cross had spent 2 decades building things meant to last forever. Luxury hotels, soaring corporate towers, entire high-end neighborhoods reshaping the Chicago skyline. AT40. He was the majority owner and principal architect of Cross and Reed Designs, one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the Midwest. High society circles called him a visionary, a man who could look at a barren plot of concrete and see a monument of glass and steel. But none of those multi-million-dollar blueprints ever mattered as much as one small boy named Noah. Noah was Ethan's entire heart walking around outside his body. The kid was a brilliant spark of pure energy obsessed with astronomy, prehistoric dinosaurs, and asking impossible existential questions right before bedtime. Ethan could still vividly recall those quiet nights. He'd be tucking Noah into his sheets, the soft glow of a galaxy projector spinning stars across the ceiling. Noah would look up, his eyes wide and bright, and ask, "Dad, if stars die, why do they still shine?" Ethan used to laugh softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from his son's forehead. "Because, buddy, some lights burn so bright, their energy keeps traveling through the universe long after they're gone." Noah made the brutal, cutthroat world of corporate real estate feel softer, safer, until the night the world shattered into a million jagged pieces. The official police report, signed off by the local authorities in upstate Wisconsin, claimed that 7-year-old Noah Cross had drowned during a weekend family boating trip on the waters of Lake Geneva. A sudden midnight storm, a slippery deck, a tragic accident. His body was never recovered. The dark, frigid depths of the lake had supposedly claimed him. But throughout the entire agonizing aftermath, Ethan's mind kept snagging on one horrifying, unnatural detail. His wife, Serena Cross, never cried. Not once. Not when the local sheriff broke the news on the docks. Not during the grueling hours of the sonar rescue search. Not even at the memorial service, while an empty coffin was lowered into the frozen earth. While Ethan was on his knees, tearing at the grass, choking on his own breath, as Noah's favorite stuffed T-Rex was placed gently beside the caskets, Serena stood completely rigid. She stood there like a statue carved from ice, elegant, impeccable in her designer black veil, watching her husband collapse into emotional ruin with eyes that weren't bloodshot from weeping, but calculating. Serena had always been beautiful in a dangerous, sharp kind of way. High, blade-like cheekbones, a perfect, symmetrical smile that never quite reached her eyes. Eyes that looked incredibly warm and radiant in carefully curated society photographs, but turned entirely vacant and hollow the moment the cameras stopped flashing. They had met 12 years earlier at a high-profile real estate charity fundraiser. Back then, Ethan thought her intense composure was a sign of elegance, discipline, emotional strength. Now, looking back through the lens of absolute tragedy. A sickening realization began to take root in his chest. Serena never loved people. She only loved the absolute power she could exert over them. In the weeks following the funeral, the atmosphere inside their sprawling Gold Coast penthouse mutated. The silence became heavy, suffocating, and hostile. Serena's patience with Ethan's paralyzing grief evaporated with terrifying speed. She didn't offer comfort. She offered calculated venomous contempt. One evening, Ethan was sitting on the floor of Noah's untouched bedroom, clutching a small, glowing model of Saturn. Serena stepped into the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed in deep disgust. "You need serious psychiatric evaluation?" "Ethan," she snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a razor blade. "You are completely obsessed with a child that is gone. It's pathetic." Ethan's head snapped up, his hands trembling so violently the model planet rattled against the hardwood. "Obsessed? Serena, he's our son. Our 7-year-old boy is at the bottom of a lake. And you're talking about him like he's a misplaced set of car keys." She didn't flinch. She just sighed, an incredibly condescending, heavy sound. "He's dead, Ethan, and your pathetic inability to move on is starting to affect our stakeholders. Clean yourself up." Then came the first psychological fracture. At exactly 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday, Ethan jolted upright in bed. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The penthouse was dead silent, save for the faint hum of the city below. But then he heard it. Pitta-patta, pitta-patta, the distinct, unmistakable sound of tiny, barefoot steps walking down the long, marble hallway. Ethan threw off the covers, his lungs burning as he rushed out into the darkness, fully believing that grief had finally cracked his sanity wide open. "Noah!" he screamed into the void. The hallway was completely empty. The cold air bit at his bare skin. But as his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he noticed something that stopped the blood in his veins. Noah's bedroom door, which Ethan personally locked every single afternoon, was slowly, silently swinging open by itself. He stumbled inside, his breath coming in ragged, short gasps. The room was freezing. He looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The glass was heavily fogged from the condensation of the cold night air. And there, written directly into the moisture in shaky, childish print, were 3 words. "I am here." Ethan's stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. He nearly dialed 911 right then and there. Instead, trembling, he bypassed the main security hub and logged directly into the penthouse's closed-circuit surveillance system from his private laptop. He rewound the footage to 10 A.M. He watched the camera feed of the hallway outside Noah's room. Nothing. No intruder. No more shadow. No movement whatsoever. Just empty, well-lit hallways. Yet, on the camera feed, the bedroom door magically unlatched and swung open on its own. Ethan didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in his study, staring at the wall, a terrifying seed of doubt taking root. Was he losing his mind? Was he experiencing severe, grief-induced hallucinations? The answers began to unravel the very next morning. Ethan walked down to the kitchen to get a glass of water. As he passed the home office, he saw Serena sitting at her desk. The glow of the monitor illuminated her sharp features. She didn't hear him approach. Ethan watched over her shoulder as her fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a hard delete command on the home surveillance server. She was wiping the exact timestamp logs from the previous night. Ethan felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. He stepped into the room, keeping his voice deliberately flat, matching her usual mask of calm. "Why are you deleting the server files, Serena?" She froze. It was only for half a second. Microscopic hitch in her breathing, but to an architect trained to notice the slightest structural flaw, it was a massive crack in her foundation. Then she turned around, her face perfectly resetting into that beautiful, empty smile. "Corrupted data. Darling, The cloud backup has been glitching since the storm last week. Don't worry about it. That was the exact moment Ethan Cross stopped mourning and started investigating his own wife, quietly, carefully. Because true instincts don't scream at you. They whisper in the dark. And Ethan's instincts were telling him something that defied all logic. Noah never drowned. 3 nights later, the whisper became undeniable. Brutal proof. Ethan was working late at his downtown architectural office. The building was completely deserted. The city outside engulfed in a blinding midnight rainstorm. Suddenly, a deafening crash shattered the silence. A heavy red brick tore through the plate glass window of his executive office, showering the mahogany floor in glittering shards. Ethan ducked, his heart racing as wind and rain poured into the room. When the dust settled, he stepped forward, his leather shoes crunching on the glass. Wrapped around the brick with a thick rubber band was a crumpled piece of construction paper. He pulled it off, flattening the damp paper on his desk under the harsh desk lamp. It was a child's crayon drawing. It depicted a small house, a massive dark lake, and a tall woman with long black hair, violently pushing a little boy into pitch black water. But it was the details that made Ethan's lungs completely seize. In the upper corners of the page, scattered around the sky, were tiny, messy, 5-pointed stars. Noah always drew stars in the corners of his pictures whenever he was scared. It was his signature coping mechanism. At the bottom of the page, written in desperate handwriting, were 3 words. She tried again. Ethan's blood turned to pure ice. He clutched the paper so tightly it tore slightly at the edges. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't grief. This was a message. That very same night, utilizing a secure, untraceable burner phone, Ethan hired Marcus Vale. Marcus was a legendary former Chicago homicide detective who had transitioned into high-stakes private espionage. He was a rugged, cynical man who had spent 25 years uncovering the sickening lies that wealthy people buried deep beneath their fortunes. Ethan met him in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, sliding the drawing across the table. "Find out what my wife is hiding," Ethan said, his voice deadly quiet, "and don't stop digging until you hit bedrock." Marcus didn't stop, and within just 4 days, he uncovered an absolute, unadulterated hell. Marcus requested an urgent meeting at his private safe. When Ethan arrived, the detective threw a manila folder onto the metal table. "I am sorry, Ethan," Marcus said, his eyes filled with a grim, heavy pity. "But your wife isn't just cold. She's a monster, and she's not working alone." Ethan opened the folder. The first documents were high-resolution, long-lens surveillance photographs. They showed Serena in the secluded VIP lounge of a luxury boutique hotel downtown. She wasn't alone. Her hands were laced intimately through the fingers of a broad-shouldered man in a bespoke charcoal suit. Damien Reed, Ethan's business partner. The man Ethan had co-founded the firm with, the man who had stood as the best man at Ethan's wedding, and whom Ethan trusted more than his own flesh and blood. They had been having a highly sophisticated, deeply hidden affair for nearly 3 years, but the betrayal of the flesh was nothing. Compared to the financial documents tucked underneath the photographs, it was a massive life insurance policy, a policy taken out on 7-year-old Noah Cross, established exactly 8 months before his alleged drowning on Lake Geneva. The payout amount, $6 million. And the records showed that Serena had personally altered the policy clauses just 6 weeks before the boating trip, adding a double indemnity rider for accidental death by drowning. Ethan felt the room spin. He gripped the edge of the table, the air leaving his chest in a ragged gasp. "She? They killed my son for a payout? It's worse than that," Marcus muttered, sliding a stack of decrypted text logs across the table. "Look at the digital footprint. They didn't just want the insurance money. They wanted the entire empire." Ethan's eyes scanned the encrypted messages between Serena and Damien. They discussed offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, secured diplomatic passports, the purchase of a secluded multi-million-dollar private estate in the hills of Portugal, And then, Ethan's eyes locked onto a single sentence sent from Serena to Damien 2 weeks before. Noah vanished, a sentence that permanently burned itself into his Once the boy is gone, Ethan becomes emotionally unstable. We trigger the psychiatric clause in the partnership agreement, prove he's legally incompetent from grief, and we take everything. Ethan stopped breathing. It wasn't just a divorce. It wasn't just an affair. It was total, calculated annihilation. They had engineered the disappearance of his only child to intentionally fracture his mind. They were gaslighting him, leaving Noah's bedroom door open, deleting security footage, and framing him as a lunatic so they could legally seize control of his multi-million-dollar architectural firm while he was locked away in a psychiatric ward. Every cruel remark, every manipulative sigh from Serena wasn't frustration. It was the slow, methodical execution of a corporate and personal execution. They weren't mourning a tragedy. They were preparing to erase him from existence. But as Ethan sat there, the overwhelming shock began to mutate. The paralyzing grief that had weighed him down for 3 months suddenly evaporated, replaced by a searing, brilliant white heat. His architectural mind, trained to analyze stress points and structural integrity, instantly went to work. Marcus, Ethan whispered, his eyes locked onto the financial ledgers. Look at this, right here, buried deep within Serena's private shell company. Bank statements was a recurring, highly anomalous cash ledger entry, a wire transfer of $10,000, sent on the first of every single month for the last 3 months. The recipients, a woman named Clara Bennett. Location, a highly isolated rural address in the dense, unincorporated woods of northern Wisconsin. Marcus pulled up Clara Bennett's background profile on his tablet. Clara Bennett, 62 years old, retired pediatric nurse. She worked at a private clinic in Chicago 10 years ago before moving off the grid. And look at the memo line on the internal bank routing wire. Ethan, beside the wire transfer description, were 2 chilling words, written in Serena's accountant's handwriting. Child supervision. Ethan didn't say another word. He grabbed his coat, walked out of the safe house, and got into his SUV. He drove for 6 agonizing hours straight through a blinding, freezing Midwestern rainstorm. He didn't call the police. He didn't alert his firm. He drove with his hands locked onto the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes fixed on the dark highway ahead. It was nearly 4 a.m. when he finally reached the coordinates. The property sat completely isolated at the dead end of an unpaved gravel road, swallowed by dense, towering pine trees. The house was an old, dilapidated hunting cabin. Dark, silent. The kind of desolate, godforsaken place where nobody would ever hear someone screaming. Ethan stepped out of his vehicle, his boots sinking into the thick mud. He walked up the creaking wooden steps of the porch and began hammering his fist against the heavy oak door. Boom, boom, boom. For 2 minutes, there was only the sound of the howling wind. Then, a faint light flickered inside. The deadbolt slid back with a heavy click. The door opened a few inches, held by a brass security chain. An elderly woman with pale, wrinkled skin and anxious, sunken eyes peered out into the darkness. Who are you? What do you want? Ethan didn't waste time with pleasantries. He threw his entire body weight against the door. Crack! The brass chain snapped out of the wood frame, and the door flew inward, sending Clara Bennett stumbling backward onto the dusty linoleum floor. She let out a sharp shriek, her face turning a ghostly, asymmetric white as she looked up and recognized the towering, furious silhouette of Ethan Cross. "Please," she gasped, pressing herself against the wall. "Please, I didn't want any part of this." Before Ethan could even open his mouth to demand answers, a tiny, creaking sound echoed from the top of the dark wooden staircase at the back of the cabin. Ethan froze. His entire body went completely rigid. A small, fragile voice floated down through the shadows. "Dad!" Ethan's knees nearly gave out beneath him. He snapped his head toward the stairs. Standing at the top of the landing, illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the window, was Noah. He was incredibly thin, his cheeks slightly hollow, wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt, but he was alive. His eyes, bright, beautiful eyes, were filled with a profound, unimaginable terror. Noah Ethan choked out, his voice cracking into a raw, emotional sob. The little boy didn't hesitate. He took the stairs 2 at a time, sprinting down the steps, his bare feet slapping against the wood. He threw his tiny body directly into Ethan's chest, wrapping his arms around his father's neck. Weeping so violently his entire frame shook, Ethan collapsed onto his knees right there on the floor, burying his face into his son's hair. Holding him so incredibly tight, the boy could barely breathe. He clutched him as if the gravity of the earth itself depended on it. "I thought you forgot about me," Noah whispered against Ethan's neck, his voice muffled by tears. "Mom told me you didn't want me anymore. She said you agreed to leave me here." That single sentence, that unfathomable psychological cruelty inflicted on a 7-year-old child, shattered something fundamental inside Ethan Cross forever. The last remnants of his civilized, rule-following self died right there on that cabin floor. He pulled back, holding Noah's face in his hands, wiping the tears away. "I would never leave you, Noah, never. Look at me. I'm here, and I am never letting anyone hurt you again." With Noah safely tucked into the front seat of his SUV, with the heater blasting, Ethan walked back inside the cabin. Clara Bennett was still cowering on the floor, weeping hysterically. Ethan stood over her, his shadow enveloping her entirely. He didn't yell. His voice was dropped to a low, rhythmic, terrifyingly calm whisper. "Talk, before I make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life in a concrete cell." Clara broke completely. She confessed to everything. There was never an accident on Lake Geneva. Serena and Damien had planned it out for months. During the late-night boat trip, Serena had slipped a massive dose of liquid sedatives into Noah's juice box. The plan was to dump his unconscious body into the deep water in the middle of the night, guaranteeing he would drown without a trace. But Noah's metabolism had resisted the drug. He woke up early, groggy, and terrified, crawling out onto the deck just in time to overhear Serena and Damien discussing exactly how they were going to report his accidental drowning to the authorities. Noah had panicked and screamed, realizing they couldn't dump a screaming child without risking him swimming or leaving physical defensive marks. Serena had to improvise on the fly. Damien called Clara Bennett, who owed him an astronomical gambling debt to a syndicate he managed. They forced Clara to drive to a secluded dock on the opposite side of the lake, bundled the terrified boy into the trunk of a car, and brought him to this cabin. Serena promised Clara $500,000 to keep Noah hidden, isolated, and completely cut off from the world until the corporate takeover of Cross and Reed Designs was fully complete. But 3 months passed. Clara sobbed, covering her face. She never sent the full payout, just $10,000 a month to keep me quiet. When I threatened to go to the police last week, Damien told me that if I opened my mouth, he'd bury me in the woods alongside the boy. I was trapped. Ethan. I was so scared. Ethan sat in the silence of the cabin, listening to the old woman's pathetic excuses, while his son sat outside in the car. Every single heartbeat inside Ethan's chest was no longer pumping blood. It was pumping pure, unadulterated, calculated rage. Not explosive, screaming rage. Cold, structural rage. The dangerous kind. The kind of rage that analyzes blueprints, finds the load-bearing pillars of an enemy's life, and prepares to pull them down until everything collapses into dust. Ethan didn't call the police that night, because when he dialed Marcus Vale from the road, the private investigator dropped another massive piece of the puzzle. Ethan, don't go to the local authorities yet. Damien Reed isn't just a corporate thief. My deep dive into his shell companies shows he has direct ties to organized white-collar financial syndicates in Chicago. Witnesses who have tried to cross him in past fraud cases have completely vanished. 2 former financial compliance officers who tried to expose internal embezzlement inside your company died in unexplained single-car accidents over the last 4 years. If you just call the local cops, Damien's legal teams and corrupt connections will have Noah papered over, moved, or silenced before a grand jury can even be seated. This isn't a legal dispute anymore, Ethan. This is absolute survival. Ethan understood perfectly. Under the deep cover of darkness, Ethan moved Noah into a highly secure, ultra-luxury penthouse downtown that he had built years ago under a blind corporate trust. He hired a team of elite, combat-vetted private security details to guard his son 24 hours a day, surrounded by state-of-the-art surveillance. Then, Ethan Cross went to war. Not an emotional, screaming confrontation. A silent, devastating, strategic war. For the next 2 weeks, Ethan acted completely normal. He went into the office every day. He sat across the boardroom table from Damien Reed, discussing architectural designs, shaking his hand, looking him directly in the eye. While knowing the man had attempted to murder his son, he came home to the Gold Coast penthouse every night, sitting across the dinner table from Serena, watching her sip her red wine, listening to her play the part of the grieving, concerned wife. The sheer psychological fortitude it took to not wrap his hands around their necks was superhuman. But Ethan kept his eyes on the ultimate prize, absolute, irreversible justice. Behind the scenes, working late into the night with Marcus Vale and a team of forensic accountants, Ethan began systematically cutting the brake lines of their entire operation, using his absolute majority voting power and hidden clauses within the company's foundational charter. Ethan secretly transferred all operational authority away from Serena's trust accounts. He quietly froze the major corporate capital reserves, routing them into secure escrow accounts that required his biometric signature alone. He recorded every single phone call, placed hidden high-definition audio bugs inside Damien's private executive suite, and tracked every single offshore wire movement Damien attempted to make. Within 10 days, the psychological pressure began to shift. The hunters were slowly realizing they were inside a trap. They just couldn't see the walls yet. Panic started spreading between Serena and Damien like a contagion. Serena logged on to her banking portals, only to find her high-limit corporate credit lines suddenly restricted under routine forensic review. Damien walked into his office to discover that federal corporate auditors had unexpectedly launched an unannounced deep-dive forensic investigation into his shell corporations, freezing his primary offshore routing nodes in Switzerland. They knew someone was systematically dismantling them. They knew a ghost was in the machine. But their immense narcissism blinded them. They never for a second suspected Ethan. They thought he was still the broken, grieving, hallucinating wreck they had spent months creating. Then Serena made her final mistake. Terrified that the federal auditors would uncover the $6 million insurance fraud scheme before the corporate takeover was finalized, Serena and Damien decided to accelerate their timeline. They decided to permanently eliminate the final obstacle. They hired a professional contract killer to eliminate Ethan Cross. They arranged for the accident to look like a tragic, grief-induced suicide. A broken father, unable to cope with the loss of his son, jumping from a high-rise structure. But the assassin never even got close to Ethan, because Marcus Vale's surveillance web got to the hitman first. The counter-confrontation took place inside a unfinished 70-story skyscraper downtown that Ethan's company was currently constructing. It was 40 floors above the glittering lights of Chicago. Raw, concrete floors. Exposed steel beams. The cold, midnight rain howling through the open structure. Ethan's private security detail had pinned the assassin to a concrete pillar, stripping him of his weapon. Ethan stepped out of the shadows, the wind whipping his trench coat around his legs. He looked at the trembling hit, then pointed a high-definition video camera directly at his face. "You have exactly 60 seconds to give me the names, the account routing numbers, and the digital authorization codes for the transfer payment," Ethan said, his voice entirely devoid of human emotion, "or my security team tosses you off this edge, and we report it as an accidental workplace slip. Choose." The assassin broke instantly. Facing a drop of 40 stories into solid concrete, he confessed to absolutely everything on camera. He detailed the exact dark web escrow account Damien Reed used to fund the hit. He pulled up the encrypted text messages on his secure device, showing Serena's personal, digital signature approving the final execution order, along with a photograph of Ethan's daily schedule. Ethan watched the recording playback once on the monitor. His face remained an unreadable mask of solid stone. He didn't hand the tape to the police. Not yet. He sent encrypted copies to 4 highly secure, independent legal servers across the globe. An absolute insurance policy. If so much as a scratch appeared on Ethan or Noah, the entire dossier would automatically broadcast to the FBI, the IRS, and every major news outlet in North America. For the first time in 3 brutal months, Ethan Cross was in complete, absolute control, and it was time to pull the trigger on the final act. The final reckoning arrived on a glittering Saturday night. It was Serena's 42nd birthday gala. The venue was the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton Inn opulent, crystal chandelier-lined hall, packed with over 200 elite guests. Billionaire real estate developers, powerful city politicians, corporate stakeholders, and high society media outlets. The champagne flowed like water. Diamonds flashed under the heavy lights. Serena stood near the center stage, wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored emerald gown. She looked radiant, laughing gracefully with a glass of vintage champagne in her hand, while Damien Reed stood mere inches away, playing the part of the loyal, supportive business partner. They were basking in the absolute pinnacle of their perceived victory, fully believing that by Monday morning, Ethan Cross would be declared legally leaving them in control of a multi-million-dollar empire. Suddenly, at exactly 9 p.m., the ambient jazz music violently cut out. The ambient ballroom lights slammed off, plunging the massive space into sudden, confusing darkness. A wave of murmurs and anxious gasps rippled through the high society crowd. "What is going on?" Serena snapped, her voice sharp as she looked around for the event coordinator. Then, the massive 30-foot ultra-high-definition projector screen directly behind her on the main stage roared to life. It didn't show a birthday tribute. The audio speakers inside the ballroom didn't play Musify Day. Erupted with the deafening, crystal playback of the assassins' filmed confession inside the unfinished skyscraper. Damien Reed ordered the hit. The assassin's voice boomed through the ballroom, echoing off the historic ceilings. Serena Cross approved the payment wire. $6 million in insurance fraud on the kid, Noah Cross. They drugged him. They hit him. They wanted Ethan dead by Monday. The entire ballroom went dead, monstrously silent. 200 people froze, their champagne glasses hovering midair, their eyes wide with absolute horror. Serena's face instantly drained of all color. The glass of champagne slipped from her fingers, shattering on the polished marble floor, splashing alcohol across her designer shoes. She looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. "Turn it off. Turn it off. Turn it off! Right now! This is a sick, doctored hoax." But the video didn't stop. It immediately transitioned into the high-resolution, forensic accounting bank statements, the encrypted text messages detailing their affair, and the terrifying photos of the isolated cabin in Wisconsin. And then the heavy, double oak doors of the grand ballroom swung wide open. A brilliant beam of light cut through the center aisle of the crowd. Walking through the doors, dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit, was Ethan Cross, and holding tightly onto his right hand. Walking proudly beside him with his head held high was 7-year-old Noah. A collective, deafening gasp exploded across the ballroom like a shockwave. Several women shrieked, covering their mouths. Shareholders stumbled backward in pure disbelief. Serena looked like she had literally seen a ghost. Her knees trembled violently beneath her dress, her hands clutching the edge of a banquet table just to stay upright. No, it's impossible. You're dead, she whispered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wheeze. Ethan and Noah walked directly up onto the stage, stopping a mere 5 feet away from her. The projector light washed over them. Noah stepped forward, his small voice amplifying clearly into the silence of the room. He pointed a steady, shaking finger directly at Serena's face. "You lied to me, Mom. You said Dad would love you more if I disappeared. But Dad came for me. You're the monster." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The public exposure was total. Their reputation, their social status, their corporate standing into unrecognizable dust in front of the very elite they had spent their lives trying to impress. Then Damien Reed cracked, realizing his life, his freedom, and his fortune were completely gone. His eyes turned wild with psychotic desperation. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulling a heavy silver semi-automatic handgun from his waistband. "You think you won, Ethan? I'll take everything from you right now," he screamed, leveling the weapon directly at Noah's chest. Guests screamed in absolute terror, throwing themselves onto the floor, scattering tables and smashing crystal. But Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He didn't feel a single molecule of fear. Without a moment's thought, he stepped directly in front of his son, shielding Noah's body entirely with his own chest, looking Damien directly in the eye with a cold, mocking smile. "Do it," Ethan whispered. Bang! The gunshot echoed through the massive ballroom like a thunderclap. But it wasn't Ethan who fell. Damien Reed stiffened, his eyes rolling back into his head, as a dark crimson pool rapidly bloomed. Across the front of his white tuxedo shirt, he collapsed backward onto the stage, his gun clattering away across the floor. Standing 10 feet away in the shadows of the ballroom exit, Marcus Vale lowered his smoking, suppressed service weapon. Ethan's elite private security detail had pre-staged the entire room. They were always 10 steps ahead. Chaos erupted as dozens of tactical law enforcement officers and federal agents flooded through every single exit of the ballroom, their weapons drawn, heavy boots stomping across the marble. They swarmed the stage, pinning a hysterical, screaming Serena Cross directly to the floor. The heavy, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the sound system as the federal agents dragged her past Ethan, her perfect hair matted, her expensive emerald dress torn. She finally lost her mask entirely. She didn't look at Ethan. She snapped her head toward Noah, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "You ruined everything," she shrieked at her 7-year-old child, her voice echoing off the walls as 200 elite members of society watched her get dragged out into the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers waiting outside. "You brat! You ruined my life." And every single influential person in that city heard her true, monstrous nature out loud. 6 months later, the dust from the explosive fallout had finally settled. Serena Cross was convicted on multiple federal counts of corporate fraud, attempted first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The judge, entirely disgusted by the profound psychological cruelty she had inflicted upon her own child, sentenced her to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. She is currently serving her time inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely forgotten by the high society circles she once craved to dominate. Damien Reed barely survived the gunshot wound to his chest, just long enough to sign a comprehensive federal plea deal testifying against Serena in exchange for a medical transfer. He died in federal custody 3 weeks later due to severe surgical complications. The mainstream media endlessly sensationalized the entire trial, dubbing it the Lake Geneva conspiracy. But Ethan absolutely hated that name, because for him, It wasn't some sensationalized corporate conspiracy. It was simply the terrifying, harrowing night he almost lost his entire world forever. He didn't care about the news cycles. He didn't care about the corporate restructuring. He liquidated his majority shares in cross and read designs, walked away from the cutthroat world of high-rise architecture, and dedicated every single hour of his life to his son's recovery. One crisp, quiet winter evening, Noah and Ethan sat together on the rooftop terrace of their new private estate outside the city. A fire roared softly in the stone pit, casting a warm, flickering amber glow across their faces. Above them, completely unbothered by the ambient light pollution of Chicago, a massive blanket of brilliant stars flickered in the freezing night sky. Noah sat, nestled tightly against Ethan's side, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, staring up at the cosmos. "Dad?" Noah asked softly, turning his head. "Yeah, buddy?" "Buddy," Ethan replied, resting his hand gently on his son's shoulder. "If stars die, why do they still shine?" It was the exact same question from all those months ago. But this time, it didn't feel heavy with grief. It didn't feel like a haunting memory from a dark past. Ethan smiled softly, pulling his son just a little bit closer, looking up into the endless, beautiful expanse of the universe. Because Noah, some lights burn with so much love, truth, and resilience that they are simply too strong for the darkness to ever disappear. Noah smiled, a genuine, radiant, peaceable smile, and leaned his head against his father's chest. And for the very first time in a very long time, Ethan Cross listened to the quiet rhythm of his son's heartbeat, and finally truly believed that the darkness was completely over. If this story gave you absolute chills, and if you felt the immense, satisfying weight of justice being served to a toxic narcissist, make sure to hit that like button right now. Tell us directly in the comments below, what is the most profound, calculated act of poetic justice or karma you have ever witnessed in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable, psychologically gripping narratives. Click the very next video appearing on your screen right now, and I will see you there.